Konami is kind of a bizarre company. In the late 80s and in the early 1990s, they created a lot of amazing and iconic games. Blades of Steel was one of the series that kind of reflects how Konami would eventually fall off. I had no idea that this was a series until I started looking stuff up online to just try to find something to talk about. It's really odd how it started off really great, and then like many other sports franchises, it tried to become more of a simulation and really failed. Konami initially released Blades of Steel in the arcades in 1987. It would then be ported to the Famicom Disk System, and then eventually to the NES. There were also a few home computers that got a release of the game as well. The arcade cabinet looks pretty cool. It uses the scheme that many arcade sports games used around the time, that being a trackball to move your character around. This was something that Atari Football used, Tecmo Bowl used, Golden Tee uses, and I guess Blades of Steel. I don't really get it. I don't personally like the trackball, but maybe it works out great. I'm probably just so used to the NES version that I probably would have a bit of an issue with it. Like many arcade sports games, Blades of Steel used this weird timer function. So you wouldn't pay for lives, you wouldn't pay for, continues or anything like that. You would actually pay for time. So you would put your quarter in, you would get a certain amount of time to play the game. If you scored a goal, you would get more time. If you did well on these bonus stages, you would get more time. It's an interesting way of doing things. It seems to work out for at least some of the arcade sports games. But then you realize you're just kind of doing the same thing. It's one of the problems when you have a game like this. You're just paying for like a minute or 30 seconds of time, and then what do you do after that if you only have one quarter and you're not very good at the game? Then you need to put in another one and hopefully do well and get more time to play the game. There are a lot of similarities between this and obviously the NES port of the game, and I'll talk more about those in just a bit. It's really cool to see where everything came from, but one thing that didn't get carried over to the NES port was the commentary. You get commentary on the game whenever you get a nice check or you steal or you score. You also get commentary on the fights, which is pretty awesome. And now that I know you have that in the arcade version, I kind of wish that could have been in the NES port, even though I know it's not technically possible. It's just really cool to go back and look at this sort of thing. The NES version of the game is the one that I'm the most familiar with. I played it an awful lot with my friends when I was little, and it's one of my favorite NES games. One thing to note here is, much like the original Tecmo Bowl and other sports games from this time, it doesn't have a player's license or a league license, which means you don't have players' names, you're not tracking stats, you don't have the team names or mascots or anything like that. What you have are just a collection of cities, and not even all of them that had NHL teams, but you had a collection of cities and the color schemes that kind of matched sometimes, but not always. Like the New York team is pretty close. I think that's really about it. Like the LA team was close to a version of their jerseys at the time. And yeah, it's kind of weird to see this. I don't remember when I was a little kid, but I do know now when I look at this, it's a little disappointing that Detroit wasn't in here, but whatever. One kind of cool thing with this is you do have some difficulty settings. You've got a tournament that you can play, you can set the difficulty, and after that, it's pretty much all downhill. You can't really do anything else with the game except for play a few hockey games. And that was all you really needed at the time. It was really great for what it was. And this is kind of where the arcade fun of this ends, and it moves into a simulation, because that's just kind of the way a lot of arcade sports games were going. There are a lot of parallels between this series and the Tecmo Bowl series, where it starts out as an arcade game, and then eventually it ends up getting licensed by the NHL and the NHL Players Association, and then it tries to become a simulation, and it just sort of doesn't work out all that well. For some reason, Konami decided that they were not going to release a Blades of Steel game on the Super Nintendo or on the Sega Genesis. So we skip ahead to the late 90s with the PS1 and the N64 version. The following two games of the series completely abandon everything that made the first game good. Konami, by this point, had acquired the NHL and the NHL Players Association license. In theory, this would have given them some name recognition. Unfortunately, it doesn't make either of these games very good. In 1999, Konami brought Blades of Steel back, but only in North America. It would be released in this region as NHL Blades of Steel 99. In Europe, the game would be called NHL Pro 99. Was there an NHL Pro 98? Not as far as I can tell. So why they needed the year on there is just kind of beyond me. So this game did let you use the Rumble Pack, so that's kind of fun. I don't know. You could also put in just the really poorly named Controller Pack, which is just Nintendo's memory card for the N64. At the time, controllers didn't really shake automatically like they do now, so Nintendo sold the Rumble Pack, which basically made your controller shake. Yeah, the 90s were a weird time. The game featured 27 NHL teams, and it used the rosters from the 1998 to 1999 season. There is also a create-a-player mode. You can play a single game, you can go through a playoff tournament. Sports games were, at this point, more of simulations, and they weren't really an arcade experience anymore. Based on the reviews at the time, NHL Blades of Steel 99 really wasn't well received. The transition from arcade action to sports simulation didn't go well. The biggest issue that the reviewers had was with the controls of the game. They're not great. I actually had more problems just looking at the screen. This honestly gave me a headache when I was playing it. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it was a real problem when I was going through this. So the N64 game was not received well, but that wasn't a big problem for Konami. All they had to do was regroup, learn from their mistakes, and try again. Since this is Konami that we're talking about, you know that didn't happen. And yeah, we ended up with Blades of Steel 2000. That was only released on the PS1. Let's get into that. The final installment is NHL Blades of Steel 2000. This was unleashed on an unsuspecting public who weren't asking for it. Well, the game had a PS1 and a Game Boy Color version. There actually was an N64 version planned. That version of the game was canceled, mercifully, but Game Informer still reviewed it in January 2000, so it was probably canceled after, I don't know, Konami received some backlash from journalists telling them that the game was crap. There is less information about this game, specifically the N64 one. It was reviewed quite a few times in 1999 and in 2000, but that's really about it. I was hoping to find the N64 ROM, but it doesn't look like it's been dumped. If it has been, please let me know. This isn't really a huge loss, but I was curious to see if someone had the game out there, because obviously review copies were sent out, so someone out there had this version of the game and had to suffer through playing it. There doesn't really seem to be much interest in archiving 20 to 30-year-old sports games, which is fair, but it makes looking up information on these in retrospect a little tricky. Things get even harder when it comes to just an obscure and poorly received sports game that wasn't released. That is the N64 story of Blades of Steel 2000. So looking at the reviews for the PS1 game, that can be kind of hilarious. The reviews in several magazines just absolutely savaged this game. My favorite came from GameFan, which encouraged the company to give up on sports games, which I thought was just hilarious, and for some odd reason it seems like Konami took that to heart when it came to the NHL games. It's kind of sad that they gave up on Blades of Steel, but given these two entries, I can kind of understand why they would give up on it. I had considered splitting the handheld games into their own section, but I didn't really think there was much of a point. The reviews for those games pretty much match their respective console games and are slightly higher in the case of the N64 and also the PS1, just because you really can't do much worse than those two, so anything would have been better. The games were released on the Game Boy and on the Game Boy Color, and you can find them pretty easily. You are just going to be playing the same thing, so if you really want to, you can find the Blades of Steel game, which is very good on the original Game Boy. I did not find the Blades of Steel 99. I have the 2001, but just wasn't really all that interested in playing them. Sadly, this is where our story ends. The first game was a classic on the NES, and the following two games are pretty forgettable. The arcade game was interesting, and I was kind of surprised that it exists, even though I really shouldn't have been. It was pretty standard practice for companies to make an arcade game and then release it on the home console at the time. Many of the early NES games are like this, so, well, I thought it was kind of surprising. I'm sure others don't really. When the series made the jump to 3D, it really seemed to struggle. It is odd that Konami would kind of resurrect Blades of Steel in that way, but they did. I think it would have been much better if they had gone the route of like NHL Hits and just stuck with a more arcade style instead of trying to make it a simulation. It's really weird that a lot of these companies would do that. When they have an arcade sports game, they just immediately try to turn it into a simulation or slowly evolve it into a simulation for some odd reason. I have some fond memories of the first game, which is, again, one of my favorite NES games. The other two were kind of a mystery to me, and I really had no idea they existed. Now that I do know about them, I'm just kind of left wondering why Konami decided to do that. Why they decided to chase after the NHL license and the NHL Players Association license and spent more money on games that didn't really need that, when they could have just gone with arcade games and made up teams that would have been better. I guess it's just another case of Konami being Konami or something along those lines. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.